Okay, welcome everybody to episode number 3 of Make Politics Positive. If you're here, it's because you survived our last hour-long foray into the world of healthcare, which my fiance Kayla watched it and she said, "This is great. I have one note. Maybe don't do it that long ever again." So we're going to do our best to keep things a little bit brief. I blame you, Stephen. If you just everything about pre-tax dollars, just like it just took us down a rabbit hole.
That's fair. I had a lot to talk about, and but it's a complicated subject.
It
But
is,
not
yeah.
everyone is like us, I guess, and that's okay. It's
It's
probably more. It's probably better that they're not like us.
truly the tragedy of the world that more people don't have hour-long discussions about pre-tax dollars. So, Stephen, something big happened before we dive into our topic today, which we're going to be talking a little bit about identity in politics and how that intersects with the political world and how we can make it more positive. But before we do, one part of your identity that was recently nourished. I heard an album came out recently. I think it was Katy Perry. Is it Katy Perry?
She did something, but the more important news is that arguably the most powerful person in the world, Taylor Swift, came out with not just one but now two singles as of the date of this recording. One of them had a very good video embracing the whole snake thing that you
Who
often
said
text me
snake?
about her.
Who said that? Was that who remembers?
So yeah, so she has two songs out, and they're perfect. And I think her album in November, I'm going to plug it right here, is going to be her best yet. So I'm very
Wow.
excited for that.
What's the second single? Because I heard like "Look What You Made Me Do," where like the old Taylor's dead apparently. But
Yeah.
what's the other one she
The
released?
second one she released during the Alabama-Florida football game, which I was not watching because I am me.
And you're from
But
Texas and don't like football.
a very odd thing, but it's called Ready. Are you ready? Well, it's called Ready for It, but I call it Are You Ready for It? And it's kind of it's not as not dark, but it's not as different as Look What You Made Me Do is. It's along her
Is it going
usual
back to
lines.
Romeo and Juliet days? Are we going?
Not quite that far, but
Okay.
it's a very upbeat song. Apparently it's now what football teams are using to pump themselves up before a game. So it's all
I
good.
Every time I want to pump myself up, I immediately go for T Swift. That is not true at all. So we're talking about identity, which if this is your first time joining us, the whole premise of this show that we started with is that Stephen is a Reagan libertarian in his own words, and I am what I guess you would call a progressive liberal. But we're actually going to talk about why that's you shouldn't define yourself by a label and how there are unhealthy ramifications of that seep into our politics. So we're specifically talking today about the ways that what makes politics so angry, what makes it to where people are so aggressive, and it seems like most of our arguments are just yelling at each other instead of learning anything. And so one of the things that we really wanted to concentrate on for this episode, which will not be an hour long, is we wanted to talk a little bit about how identity is formed, and we'll finish with some ways that you can challenge your political identity to try to be a healthier, more well-rounded person. So, Stephen, how do people form their political identity? What ramifications does that have?
I think there's some initial things that you can't help that just automatically, naturally inform your identity. That's race, age, gender, sexuality, all of those things that kind of you're born with, and so those obviously inform some of the political decisions and behaviors that you have. But I think going beyond that, people get very interested and very attached to these ideologies and worldviews that then some of them are ideologies, worldviews that directly are political, and some of them, such as we use religion for an example, is something that doesn't have a direct political kind of component to it, but nonetheless does have political effects. And so I think as people develop kind of their personality and the different associations that they're involved with, that seeps into then their political thoughts, their political behavior. And often you have people who then will classify themselves and what I was calling kind of that self-imposed segregation. And I know that you had a different term for it, but they classify themselves into these boxes. And then it becomes very hard to get out of that box because you become so used to viewing things through that lens that it's a challenge to step outside. And even you get to the point where when you do step outside of that box, it becomes very uncomfortable. Like it's a negative feeling that happens. You don't, confirmation bias is something that I think most people are familiar with. We don't like seeking information that contradicts what we believe. We consume certain media simply because we know that it will confirm our beliefs. And so that's kind of the basis of it. It has a lot of different negative implications, but the big one is that it just makes it so hard to open up to anything different.
What when you say just what TV station do you get your, where do you, well, maybe not TV, where do you get your news from, Stephen? I'll tell you where I get mine.
Yeah, so I cut cable, which is like the greatest decision I think I've ever made in my life. So now my favorite, what's that?
I said cosign. This is clearly a millennial hosted show because I'm the same way. Sorry, keep going.
But I primarily get it from a morning newsletter from a place called 180report.com. And what I like about it is it gives you a morning, noon, and evening edition of all the top headlines from the left, all the top headlines from the right. And usually they're not the hyper partisan sites, but nonetheless ones with the left and right slant to them. And then I go on Twitter, which is the worst thing that you can do when you're looking for informed news. But I like to see reactions to it, and then I like to put them away. But nonetheless, I don't really go to the ideological extremes. Like I know plenty of people who they'll listen to Fox or MSNBC, which are not as extreme as you could get, but nonetheless, there's a blatant bias there. But sometimes I like to poke around on those bias sites too, just to kind of see. It's more from the lens of like, how are people thinking about certain subjects, and kind of how are they spinning it, for lack of a better term.
No, I feel the same way. I actually, during the Obama administration, when I got super depressed because of the way politics had become, I stopped for the most part watching the news, and like you said, spent a lot of time watching what other people were saying about the news, watching the things that people were talking about and things people were consuming. I am a terrible news consumer. Like the only website that I really look at from a policy perspective is probably Vox, which is run by Ezra Klein, which I will say that they're smarter than a lot of sites, but can still definitely be left-leaning and biased in their beliefs. And then a lot of the rest of what I read is usually yours is Twitter, mine is Reddit, and I know you read Reddit as well. But Reddit is usually the place they go, and usually it's my usual process goes. I see a headline that's related to news. I open up, I don't read the article. I skip to the comments, and I'm just like, what are people yelling about today? And that's a very I don't know. I've been like that for a long time. I subscribed to I used to read Drudge Report just in Breitbart, just because I think at that point in my life when I was much younger, it was much like I was addicted to the anger of just sort of like, not that I was angry, but I was like, how can people think this? And definitely was not, I mean, you learn more about what other people are talking about, but I don't know if you learn to value why they're saying it. So
I think you and I are just interested. You and I have a personality where we're interested in how other people process things and how they think about things. And so I definitely understand the comments thing, because I know, especially on Reddit, I know those comments will make me feel like the world is not great, but I still go there anyways, just because in some ways, this may sound bad, but in some ways I kind of want to feel better about myself in the sense that, or at least I'm not commenting that on the internet. But
that's a good point. That is 100% what it is. It is all based on, we've gotten now meta, right? Like, look at these people in their liberal conservative camp. stereotypes. We're way better than all of that. We're above the fray, which is just as ridiculous and just as much an identity as anything else. So if you're watching this and you're thinking, who are these jerks? That is you're right. We are jerks. We're just one level removed from the fray jerks, but jerks nonetheless. That could be that somehow we should just jerks. the political.
That's merchandise we could sell just
There
on
you
a
go.
T-shirt. Jerks, yeah.
Just you and me with jerk on our chest. Jerks. That's one of those words that you get satiatic. I forget what it's called, but when you say a word too many times and it starts sounding jerk.
And it doesn't make sense anymore.
Yeah, satiation. It doesn't matter. All right, so we defined the problem. And by the way, part of the problem, and we were talking about this prior when we were preparing for this. One of the reasons why this becomes such a problem in our political system is because of how our brains work. And our brains, if you think of these wonderful thinking mechanisms, think of them for a moment just like a machine. People don't think a lot of times about how brain power drains energy and resources from their body. And that doesn't mean that, like, don't think because you'll get tired. It means do think, but treat it like exercise. And a big reason why people don't like changing their minds is because it takes energy. It takes emotional and physical energy for your brain to do critical thinking and to challenge the things that it believes. That's sort of an interesting concept to think about, because people don't think of themselves like, oh, I'm too tired to think about that. But if you think about people who, I mean, like, I think of any time something is posted on the internet about vegetarianism, and Stephen just survived a month of being vegetarian. But people tend to immediately get very animated and just say, but animals are delicious. And regardless of if you've ever said that or not, really what you're doing in that is saying, I don't want to engage in the moral implications of this. I like to keep things very simple. Bacon tastes good. I eat bacon. And in doing that, you preserve your mental energy. You preserve, I don't have to think about this. This is something that I don't have to challenge. And I think that just like any time where you're like, oh, do I really want to exercise that muscle? Nah. I think that a lot of times that's the reason why it becomes so hard for people to challenge the views. Also, because, and I'll finish this thought and then stop ranting. Also because people, and I watched listened to a really great podcast from Ezra Klein on Vox, where he was with this lady who talked about why people don't change their mind. One of the things they talked about is that all of the social pressures, all of the social cues that we experience all push us toward not changing our mind. Changing your mind is looked at as being weak. It's looked at as being, to use John Kerry's famous epithet, a flip-flopper. And so it looks like, oh, you weren't right. And there's some shame in that. And it's also, in addition to that, the benefits of changing your mind are very little. Like, nobody is like, oh, great for you for changing your mind. Quite the opposite. In fact, we're like, how could that person change their mind? How could they convolute things? So people are more comfortable when things are steady and stable and predictable. And all of our social cues work against us changing our mind. Would you agree with that, Stephen?
I would agree. You especially see that, as you brought up with John Kerry, but in any election, there's this stigma behind if you believe something at one point in time and then you've changed your mind, you're a flip-flopper. And this came up a lot with, obviously, Obama, the Mitt Romney campaign. It comes up in all of our elections that we don't allow people to have this moment where you get new information. You can then change your opinion about things because of that. And actually, that brings up a question, and I think this could be interesting. What's something that you have changed your mind on? And then I'll answer for my part.
So this will be fun. As somebody with a prospective political career, I will go ahead and walk. I think that as we talk about politics being authentic, I'll go ahead and answer that in a way that future political strategists will be like, what was he thinking? I think the one thing that I have very much changed my mind on when I stopped viewing it from a team angle and started viewing it more from just a what do I think about it angle is the Second Amendment and gun rights. I think that I totally, as a liberal progressive person, I totally get where people are coming from with the idea that like there shouldn't be guns all over the place. Like guns are way too easily accessible. They're way too dangerous. They kill too many people in the United States. And I think all of those things are probably true. But I also think that we live in a world where you're not going to unring that bell at this point. There are a lot of guns, and it is unlikely that you are going to get to the point where suddenly, like, if you're going to change the amount of guns that are around, that has to be a cultural change as opposed to a legal change, probably at this point. And I think a lot of people do get scared of the idea of, you know, somebody could come to my house and how would I protect myself? Which that has some whole other notions about how Americans culturally are so fearful of, you know, whatever. But I think that that's one thing that I probably changed my mind on. I would say that, yeah, we don't need like super high power weapons out there that can, you know, that could kill a tank. We don't need, you know, free. I think there are some reasonable checks that you can put on that in terms of background checks and not providing it to people with mental illness. And I think gun safety courses are a good idea. But in general, I think I'm pretty amenable to the fact that most people have guns, and that's probably not going to change anytime soon. What about you?
So for me, it was before I truly really understood what being a libertarian or a libertarian leaning person was. I was a big fan of someone named Rick Santorum. And really it was because of the sweater vest, if we're being honest. Like I really liked the fact that he had some merchandise, a sweater vest with his logo. But, you know, part of the things with that I look back and cringe on is I believed in his stance on many social issues. And I think it's fair to say in 2012, I was not comfortable with my identity, since we're talking about identities, and since you know, being a gay conservative, I believe that people should be able to get married to whoever they want to get married to, and that was something that I had to change on. But also just social issues in general of how much the government should regulate what adults want to do, and so that was a big change for me.
That makes sense. I never knew you were a Rick Santorum fan.
Oh yeah.
You've of course heard of the whole effort to redefine his name.
Oh yeah, by what was that, Michael Savage? Is that who?
Dan Savage. Dan Savage.
Dan Savage. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Who is a very interesting writer. Very
That's a way to
interesting.
describe him. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very a man with strong opinions.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I think that that's a good question. I didn't know you were going to ask that, but I think that it's good for everybody to change their minds from time to time on things, or at least be open to changing their minds. I will tell you, we were talking about Thanksgivings and our angry Thanksgiving. I remember, and I think back to this, and it was so much of my identity that I felt was getting attacked. There was a Facebook post that I had shared, that my aunt had posted about something about guns, and I had responded back to it with what I thought was a very reasonable answer. I don't even remember what the argument was, to be honest. But what I do remember is she said, "You don't know anything about this." And I was like, I was so offended because I was college educated. Like, I read books, and I was so upset. And I went to Thanksgiving and just stewed the whole time on that because she attacked my identity. But it's funny because my view on guns has changed a little bit since then.
I think we've all been there. But so thinking about some of the ways to maybe combat that, I guess we can get into some of the solutions. We talked a little bit before we started recording about, like, there was the whole Starbucks campaign of just grab a coffee with someone who is from on the different side of the political aisle with you, which, by the way, they never matched me with anybody. So I never got my free coffee, but that's okay. I'll let them slide on that. What are some, because I know that you had a couple of ways that you outlined. Do you want to share some of those of like how, when we do have conversations with people who we disagree with, how are some productive ways to have that conversation?
Totally. And I had three, and these might as well, I don't know how people will respond to these, but they're things to keep in mind that I always keep in mind when I try to have conversations with someone. Before you do, one of the challenges that we talked about that goes back to the Starbucks things is that people, a lot of times, it's not that they don't want to talk to people who disagree with them or have different views. It's that they just a lot of times aren't exposed to them. And when they are exposed to them, a lot of times they're exposed to them in atmospheres where it's like, whoa, you're not on our team. You're not welcome here. I had 3 of them. Number 1 is when you have a conversation with someone, seek to learn, not to win. And part of this is the subtitle of this is why arguing is stupid. Because generally when you tend to argue with someone, you think, I'm going to win this argument. I'm going to show them why they're wrong. And what happens is that none of that happens at all, because anytime you try to argue with someone, they immediately retreat back into their identity. You are attacking not what they believe, you are attacking who they are. And as a result of that, we'll fight and flail, and like you said, with confirmation bias, we'll reject any information that challenges who they think they are. So the number 1 thing is seek to learn, not to win. So listen to somebody and just hear what they think and what their perspective is. And think of this not from the perspective of, I'm going to win this argument against this person, but I'm going to be more informed about what people who disagree with me believe and can kind of hone my ideas a little bit better. One of the ideas that is my nemesis idea that I chew on all the time in my head is that the whole idea that taxation is theft. In no part of me believes that. But being able to articulate why is a challenge, and it's one that I'm continuously working on, because you should be able to answer why it's not theft. But as an aside, do you believe that? Do you believe taxation is theft, Stephen, or how do you feel about
it? No, because this is funny because with my media network Outset, we have people on the team who do believe that, and it frustrates me. Not because I disagree with it, but I want to go into, no, you're wrong, because I've read books on social contract theory. But sometimes that's not always the best way of going about it. And so I've had to do a very hard thing, which is just agreeing to disagree with people like that. But yeah, that's definitely an argument that keeps me up at night, you could say.
Yeah, well, it's because it's something that's nuanced, and anytime you get into nuance is difficult. Part of the going back to what don't people don't like nuance. People like black, white, good, bad, right, wrong. Like nuance is tough. So number 2 is keep your identity small. This is one that I got actually from that Ezra Klein Vox podcast that I was listening to, about the more words I am, and this concludes, what liberal, progressive liberal, or Reagan conservative, or Reagan libertarian, or whatever you want to, I'm a Tea Party Republican, or I'm a Bernie Democrat, or whatever it happens to be. The bigger you make your identity, the more that you feel you have to defend that identity, as opposed to being open to accepting new facts. So this is keep your identity small by understanding that you are not your beliefs, and that kind of leads into the third one. The third one, which I 100% stole from CGP Grey, which is a great YouTube video series. Treat opinions like t-shirts, not tattoos. People tend to treat the things that they believe like they are burned onto their body, and somebody is assaulting their humanity and their whole being, as opposed to just treating the things they believe like something that is just kind of they choose and can choose to get rid of. So if you got schmutz on your shirt, you would change your shirt. If your opinion doesn't work anymore, change your opinion. So being able to think of the things that you believe as something that you carry around, as opposed to something that is on your body. So thank you to CGP Grey for that idea that I have shamelessly ripped off and been teaching to students all around the country for the past 3 or 4 years now. What do you think, Stephen? Anything else that you would want to add in that you think can combat this idea that I am this and I will fight to the death to defend it?
Yeah, I think first is just kind of understand, and this is a very this is simple thinking, but understand that we're all playing on the same team at the end of the day, and from the standpoint of there are very few people in this country, in this world, who want to see things go bad. Like there's very few people. This idea that you often see people say, Democrats just want the country to suffer, or Republicans just want the country to suffer. That's not actually what's going on, as hard as that is to believe. There aren't Republicans and Democrats in mass sitting around thinking about how can we destroy the country. And so I think that's the first important lens to view it through. The other thing I already said is just have a moment where you're okay with agreeing to disagree and walking away from a conversation without solving problems. Like our last discussion, we didn't solve anything. We didn't necessarily even agree on a comprehensive solution, but we laid out our case, and we agreed to disagree with each other on a couple of things. I think that's a really helpful thing to do as well. But also, acknowledge where you're coming from. I mean, acknowledge that you may very well have a limited point of view because you're within a certain box, because you've classified yourself as something. And I think that's kind of that's one thing that people don't often do, is they don't often think, I could be wrong because I only view things through this certain lens. And so I think the first step to expand that is to admit that. So that's just what I would add to it. But I think that's a pretty good standpoint from it. I also realize that it won't always perfectly happen that way. Like this is a very controlled environment where you and I are able to talk about issues, but there are environments that people get involved with that are not as conducive to a constructive conversation, like on the floor of Congress, maybe, where emotions get high and things like that. So that's what I would add to it.
I think that those are great points. I will say that whole idea of like being able to understand that you could be wrong, like constantly acknowledging the reality that you could be wrong on this, is such a humbling, and like it feeds into itself. Once you see that you could be wrong on one thing, you realize you could be wrong on anything. And that's a whole other like rabbit hole to go down of like, you go from a position of assuming you're right and rejecting all efforts to prove otherwise, to believing that you're wrong most times and finding and consistently trying to like find reasons to shore up what you believe, which is challenging and draining. But also, at least for me, like also very comforting, because I don't feel like I have to defend an identity. I don't feel like that there's some kind of right that I am a part of that I have to defend, which is sort of nice. No, I think that we've solved this problem. I think that the people will watch this. Nobody will ever have these issues again. I will say that as part of my identity, calling myself a Kanye West fan in the Kanye versus Taylor Swift battle is part of my identity, and I'm not willing to compromise on that.
So right in the middle, as we were trying to conclude this week's episode on identity politics, Curtis's internet crashed. It's probably a conspiracy to keep us from putting these episodes out, but nonetheless, we persisted. You can follow us, if you're looking to connect further, you can follow us on social media, on Twitter at Positive Polls, that's positive POLS, and on Facebook.com/MakePoliticsPositive. And until our next episode, thanks so much for tuning in. Take care.